Just the lights down this much.
You know, again, I don't know this room. I couldn't quickly find the configuration. It seemed like there was one in either front or all.
What do you think? Do you want more lights? I feel like it might be a little too dark.
Yeah.
Too many people are really
It's gonna get darker.
Yeah.
Actually, the camera looks pretty good.
Oh, the camera looks good. Still, I think that's good.
I don't like the fact that I don't see any other participants yet.
Yeah, that's kind of weird. Dude, are we still in test mode or something?
No, I hit start and it's recording, so
Doesn't seem right.
no. Like if I click here, I get to invite. But Josh has to set this up. Something's on his end.
Trying to get. Not sure if this is into the weapon. I don't know. It's recording. And maybe you don't see the people. I don't know. I haven't done the webinar before.
You should see them. I should be able to see everyone that's
Yeah,
in
right.
it. I don't know. Just send Josh a message. Check. See more. I'm just set up as a panelist, which means I can do things, but
Yeah, maybe you can't. Josh says you're host.
Josh just messaged me. Okay, Josh is going in now. Maybe just jump out people.
It seems really odd.
Extremely odd considering there are like maybe some people that registered.
Yeah. Wonder if there's like a link mix up or some kind.
This is the link that went out to everyone.
Well, we are recording, right? We have it. I guess we can always share it.
I guess we just start then and
Yeah,
we share a recording if people aren't able to see it.
that's my take. Yeah.
We don't see anybody else coming into the webinar. It's just Josh and I.
Hey guys.
Yeah, but nobody else has come in. So that's what has us concerned. Okay. Hey.
That's okay.
What's it say?
You just said that the button to the register to register on the website doesn't work.
Is he just now trying to register?
Yeah.
Okay. It cut off like 24 hours prior through
Oh, let me go
CVent.
to the link and see if that works.
Yeah, forward him the direct
We would
link. and
really
it
like to know
should.
what's working.
I think,
If you did not do, loose, you know.
oh,
or
okay.
something.
Wouldn't
Where should I start? Because I feel like-
want to forward you
Yeah,
the
I
link.
think that's our
It's
fault.
okay.
I mean, that's our senses. We don't know what's
Are you
going on.
gonna see the Q&A?
The Q&A is still here, so we should see it.
All right, good afternoon, everyone. We have been having a few technical challenges, so actually it might be useful for someone out there on the Zoom, if you could just send us a message in the Q&A possibly, to make sure that we know that you're there. Right. All right, we'll look out for that. All right, so welcome. I'm Lynn Thomas, and I'm a professor of African history and gender history here at the University of Washington. And it's my great pleasure to welcome you to the 8th annual Stephanie M.H. Camp Memorial Lecture on the history of race and gender. As this afternoon's lecture, like each year's lecture, speaks to the history of race and gender, as well as to the long history of U.S. colonialism, it is especially important to recognize at the outset that the University of Washington is housed on the land of the Coast Salish peoples, land that touches the shared waters of all tribes and bands within the Suquamish, Tulalip, and Muckleshoot nations. So we acknowledge those nations, their deep history, and their ongoing stewardship of these lands. So this lecture honors the work and life of our dear colleague, Stephanie Camp. When Professor Camp passed away in 2014 at the tender age of 46 years, she was the Donald W. Logan Endowed Chair in American History. Stephanie was a renowned scholar. She authored the award-winning and much-taught book that you see here, Closer to Freedom, in 2004. She also co-edited the important volume, New Studies in American Slavery, and several other articles, including on the history of race and beauty. And that was a book project that she was working on before she passed away, on beauty and race in the US. So for those of you who didn't know Stephanie personally, I think it's important to share that she was a person of enormous grace and style and wit. She was tremendously generous as an intellectual, as a mentor, and as a teacher. And even more importantly, she was a beloved mother, sister, daughter, and friend. For the past 2 years, we've held this lecture remotely. So this year, it's a joy for some of us to be back together in person here at the University of Washington, to be here together in this room to celebrate Stephanie's life and her scholarship. I also though want to welcome all of you who are joining us remotely. And I'm grateful that hopefully our hybrid format's working, and that this enables Stephanie's family and friends from outside of Seattle to be present with us here right now. In particular, I'd like to acknowledge Stephanie's father, Professor Emeritus of Art, Donald Camp, and her mother, Marie Camp. I also want to acknowledge Stephanie's beloved son, Luke Ariani, and his father, Mark. We are deeply honored by their presence, and we thank them for raising and loving such a fierce intellect and such a beautiful person. So amazingly, as has been the case for the past 8 years, this lecture day here in Seattle is a Stephanie Camp kind of day. It's sunny, though slightly cool, spring day. Our rain-soaked greenery is on dramatic display today. The dogwoods are blooming, and the lupins and the peonies are just about to flower. It's the kind of day when Stephanie would have donned her overalls, picked up her trowel, and headed into her garden to draw life and to draw color from the soil. So today we honor Stephanie's many contributions to our lives and to our world. And of course, those contributions include her intellectual contributions to her chosen fields of study, the history of slavery and the history of Black women in the United States. So few historians today speak as eloquently and powerfully to this intersection of topics as this year's distinguished lecturer, Professor Caleb McDaniel. But before I introduce Caleb, I want to say thanks to a few people. So first, I'd like to thank all of those who continue to contribute to the Stephanie Camp Memorial Lecture Fund and who keep this lecture series alive each year. I also want to thank our co-sponsors this year. So the Department of History, the UW Libraries, the Simpson Center for the Humanities, the Department of Gender, Women's Sexuality Studies, and especially this year, the African Studies program. So thanks to all of you for your generous support. I also want to thank some UW colleagues, so Jordana Balkin, Stephanie Smallwood, and Chandran Reddy, as well as History Department Chair Glennis Young, and History staff members Josh Apfel, Eric Johnson, and Nick Grail, for all of their support in pulling this event together this year. Finally, I want to single out and thank Professor Charla Fett of Occidental College, who is seated right over there in the middle of the room. So many of you will recall that Charla gave the camp lecture 2 years ago in 2020 when we were fully online. And so it's wonderful to have her with us in person today. Thank you for being here. All right, so just one note about questions for the people who are Zooming in. So you can put your questions in the question and answer, and then we will relay them to Professor McDaniel when we get to that point. All right, so we now have the great fortune of thinking through the history of slavery, emancipation, and reparations with a truly gifted historian and a friend of Stephanie's, Caleb McDaniel. So Caleb is the Mary Gibbs Jones Professor of Humanities at Rice University. He also currently serves there as the chair of the History Department and as the co-chair of Rice's Task Force on Slavery, Segregation, and Racial Injustice. He is the author of 2 award-winning books. The first book, The Problem of Democracy in the Age of Slavery, was published in 2013. And then his second book, The Sweet Taste of Liberty, A True Story of Slavery and Restitution in America, which is what we're going to be hearing from today, was awarded the Pulitzer Prize just 2 years ago. So the Pulitzer Committee lauded Sweet Taste of Liberty as, quote, a model of historical research and writing. And they described it as a beautifully crafted account of a remarkable Black woman, Henrietta Wood. An account, though, that is much more than just a biography of a remarkable woman. Caleb contextualizes Wood's life in ways that teach us much about the 19th century, but they also offer a timely meditation on reparations for racial injustice in our 21st century. Caleb joined the faculty at Rice in 2008, and that was actually the very same year that Stephanie Camp joined the faculty at Rice. And for those of you who knew Stephanie will recall she spent 2 years at Rice and in Houston before she returned to us here in Seattle, which of course we were very happy about. But I'm sure people at Rice were, yeah, they missed her when she returned here. So while together at Rice, Stephanie and Caleb became colleagues and friends. And as I understand it, Stephanie was an important mentor to Caleb when he was an assistant professor. So my guess is that Stephanie would be enormously proud of everything that Caleb has recently accomplished for their shared field of study. So please join me in welcoming Professor Caleb McDaniel to deliver the 2022 Camp Memorial Lecture.
Thank you so much, Lynn, for that gracious introduction and for the invitation to speak to you all today. Thank you to Nick and Eric and all those who have planned this event and all those who are in attendance either remotely or here. It truly is a deep honor and a humbling experience to be delivering the Stephanie Camp Memorial Lecture. As you heard, Stephanie and I became colleagues at Rice University at the same time, and looked for housing and learned about this new institution and City of Houston together. And even though it was only 2 short years, as Lynn reminded us, that we were able to benefit from her work as a member of the Rice faculty. In that time, it was my privilege to learn from Stephanie's fierce conscience and her openness and hospitality, her generosity, to me in particular and so many others as a junior faculty member. And considering what she meant to me as a mentor just in those 2 years, I can well imagine what she meant to this institution and so many of her colleagues and students and friends here in Seattle. I wish that we could have kept her longer, as we all certainly do. I was fortunate to be able to, of course, stay in touch with Stephanie after she returned here to Seattle. She remained vitally involved in the training of her graduate students at Rice well up until the final months of her life. And we would, of course, continue to see each other at conferences for the Organization of American Historians and other societies that we belong to together. And of course, her work lived on and remained extremely influential in my own career trajectory. And so I want to say just a few words about this remarkable book, Closer to Freedom, Stephanie's prize-winning monograph on enslaved women and everyday resistance. It's difficult for me to think of another monograph that had such a high ratio of astonishing insights and contributions to the field to pages. In this slim volume, Stephanie reframed our thinking of slavery in the antebellum South as a violent spatial imaginary, as a geography of containment, as she put it. And she really emphasized confinement and captivity as the essence of enslavement, while at the same time, she redefined everyday resistance as a kind of rival geography, a way in which enslaved women claimed space and used their bodies in ways that defied that geography of containment. She coined the term body politics and free bodies and discussed the pleasures of resistance, the ways that enslaved women at secret parties and through the adornment of their dresses experienced emotions that went beyond the containment that slavery meant in their lives. And I could be corrected on this point, but I believe that Stephanie may have been the first to provide a critical analysis of the use of the term hands as a kind of metonomical euphemism for enslaved laborers in the Cotton South. Of course, there's the wonderful chapter in the book about California's house, an enslaved woman who posted abolitionist prints on the walls of her house in the plantation South and briefly inserted herself into the sectional politics of the coming of the Civil War. Of course, most of all, what Closer to Freedom insisted upon was the centrality of enslaved women and their experience and their everyday resistance to the understanding not only of the history of slavery, but to the history of the United States itself. And it's really to this contribution that I am most indebted. It goes without saying that I could not have written Sweet Taste of Liberty, the book that I'm speaking to you about today, were it not for the efforts of Black feminist historians like Stephanie and those who came before her to insist on the need and the centrality of studying enslaved women. And this is something that I think, if you think back to 2004, even though that seems not too long ago, it was a period in which to write a book like this with this subtitle was to make a bold statement about the field. Deborah Gray White's Aren't I a Woman, of course, blazed a trail for historians of enslaved women that was published in 1985 and became the first book, I understand from Professor White's memoir, to receive a Library of Congress subject heading for, quote, woman slaves. This was the first book to necessitate the Library of Congress to create such a subject heading. And to read the titles of the books since then, including Stephanie's work, Closer to Freedom in 2004, is to see how much the field has changed due to the work of historians like Stephanie. And so to me, and I thank Lynn for kindly mentioning the recognition of Sweet Case of Liberty and Henrietta Wood by the Pulitzer Board, it would not be possible for the Pulitzer Board, I think, to recognize the history and the story of an ordinary enslaved woman with no obvious connection to a US president or other major event in American history, and to designate that story as an important chapter in the history of the United States. That, I think, would not be possible and would not have happened without the work of Stephanie Camp and other historians who paved the way. There's another reason why I'm especially honored to be here today, and that is because almost exactly 7 years ago this week, I was invited here to attend a conference in Stephanie's honor and memory, Ever Closer to Freedom, on May 7th and 8th of 2015. And really that conference was the genesis of the book that I'm speaking about today. The first writing that I did for this project that was shared with a scholarly audience was for that conference in 2015. Now, the planning for the conference began in the wake of Stephanie's passing in 2014, and initially my plans for what to speak about at the conference were very different. It was not until September of 2014 that I learned about an article published in a small town Ohio newspaper, the Ripley Bee, in 1879 that began with the arresting headline, "Kidnapped and Sold into Slavery." And in that article, which stretched over 3 issues of the Bee, I read the astonishing story of Henrietta Wood, a Black woman who was living in freedom in Cincinnati, Ohio in 1853, when she was kidnapped and taken across the Ohio River and enslaved in northern Kentucky by Zebulon Ward, who was working as a deputy sheriff at the time. Wood was eventually sold to a slave trading firm who took her down the Mississippi River to Natchez, where she was contained on a cotton plantation in the Natchez district until 1863, the middle of the Civil War, when her enslaver in Natchez forced some 300 enslaved people to march some 400 miles west to the state of Texas, and not far from Houston, where I teach now, where she remained for the remainder of the Civil War. Now, this story of kidnapping and sale down the river to the Deep South, of course, is reminiscent of the much better known story of Solomon Northup, who in his memoir, 12 Years a Slave, later turned into an Academy Award winning film, was living as a free Black man in New York when he too was kidnapped and taken to a Red River plantation in Louisiana. But his story ended differently. He regained his freedom and returned to New York. In 1853, he published a memoir about that experience in the same year when Henrietta Wood's long odyssey began. Wood, of course, would not taste freedom again until after the Civil War and the formal abolition of slavery. But her story also had a significantly different ending than Northup's that also played out in this interview in the Ripley Bee in 1879. Because when Wood, after the Civil War, managed to return to Cincinnati, Ohio, the scene of the crime in 1853, she had not forgotten the man, Zebulon Ward, who enslaved her in 1853. And she filed a lawsuit in a local court in Cincinnati demanding $20,000 in lost wages and damages for her long ordeal. After 8 long years of litigation that eventually moved to a federal court in Cincinnati. In 1878, she received a verdict in her favor and was awarded $2,500, a small fraction of what her petition had demanded, but the largest known sum of restitution ever paid out by a U.S. court to a formerly enslaved person. So as I said, I first learned about Wood's story in September 2014, just a few months before I was to pre-circulate a paper for this conference here on campus in May 2015. And I tried to do a 180 in my presentation, and throughout that fall, sought to learn as much as I could about the case as it was unfolded in this interview. And what was remarkable was the specificity and the accuracy of Wood's memories in these articles. Her recall of the names of Zebulon Ward, for example, the man who had kidnapped her, enabled me to learn a great deal about Ward in that fall. Her recollection of the name of the man in Natchez, Gerard Brandon, who had purchased her there and forced her to Texas during the Civil War, enabled me to find a diary that Brandon had kept of that trip, in which he mentioned Henrietta by name. And I had even in that fall of 2014 located the first US Census record from 1870 in which Henrietta Wood appeared by name, along with the name of a son who was listed in the US Census record as Arthur Simmons. So I had the beginnings of a context and a set of details around this interview when I came to Seattle in May 2015. And there I was introduced, as so many of you already had been, to the wonderful scholarly community that Stephanie had created through her intellectual generosity and collegiality with so many. I heard stories about Stephanie that I had not heard before. I felt a new sense of camaraderie, and listening to Professor Ed Baptist recall the day in the archives when Stephanie had stumbled upon the records discussing California's abolitionist prints in her house, and the way that discovery in the archive had reoriented that entire chapter and her way of thinking about space in enslaved people's dwellings on plantations, in much the same way that my paper had been turned upside down by this Ripley B. interview. I listened to presentations by scholars, junior scholars who have been inspired by Closer to Freedom in their own work. And I can recall Sawanda Mustakeen speaking about her research looking at the physical disfigurement, the scars of victims of the Middle Passage and the transatlantic slave trade, as providing a new way of thinking about a detail from Henrietta Wood's interview in the Ripley Bee, when she recalled a reunion in her life with a brother, a boy named Joshua, that she remembered as a child falling and scarring himself on a coffee kettle. I received reading recommendations from people who were at the conference, including Jennifer Morgan pointing me to Neil Roberts' wonderful book, Freedom as Marronage, which shaped my thinking about the narrative of the book and the importance of resisting final determinative endings in narratives about freedom. But in addition to all of that, what the conference really did was provided me with a set of questions and frames for thinking about Henrietta Wood's story that was so vital as I started on this project. I can recall vividly, even though I was speaking on May 8th, talking on May 7th, the day before that presentation, with Professor Luther Adams about the story. And of course, Professor Adams' own work in African American history in Kentucky made him very interested to hear about what had happened to Wood with her kidnapping and her re-enslavement. And as I told him a little bit about the story and reached the climax, as I thought of it at that point, that she had returned to Cincinnati and filed a lawsuit, he asked the question that so many that I told the story to asked: did she win? And as we talked about that question, though, Professor Adams really forced me to think hard about the many layers of that question and the many kinds of winning and losing that were present in Henrietta Wood's story, and about whether the law was able to fully redress what she had suffered at the hands of Ward and Brandon. In the same way, Liz Pryor, who was there at the conference, posed the question after my presentation: how would Wood herself have answered the question of whether she won, which stuck with me throughout the writing of this book. And of course, many of the attendees thought with me about the larger context of the struggle over reparations, in which we were thinking about Henrietta Wood's story together. Of course, in the summer of 2014, Ta-Nehisi Coates had published an award-winning magazine article making the case for reparations. And when I first began reading about Henrietta Wood's case and trying to learn as much as I could about her life, it had occurred to me that in the midst of all of the debate that was occurring in the public sphere about reparations, cases for reparations, cases against reparations, was this a case of reparations that might inform contemporary debates? And I was grateful for the fact that several colleagues at the conference pushed me to place this case in the longer history of reparations claims and struggles for reparations that stretched back to the very beginnings of the nation itself. Several called to mind and connected Henrietta Wood's story with the famous letter of Jordan Anderson, who had been enslaved in Tennessee, but received a letter from his former enslaver after the Civil War, as he was living in Dayton, Ohio, asking him to return and take up a job on the plantation where he had been confined and held captive. And Anderson wrote in response a public letter that calculated the costs of redress and published it to his old master, Colonel T.H. Anderson. He said, "I served you faithfully for 32 years, and Mandy, his wife, 20 years. At $25 a month for me and $2 a week for Mandy, our earnings would amount to $11,680. Add to this the interest for the time our wages have been kept back, deduct what you paid for our clothing and 3 doctor visits to me, pulling the Duke for Mandy, and the balance will show what we are in justice entitled to." Anderson's letter and also Wood's case pointed to a history of formerly enslaved people calculating and tallying the value of their labor over many years. And whether in Anderson's letter mentioning $11,680 or Wood's petition for $20,000, this suggested that Wood's case was not an isolated incident, but part of a much larger story that included, in fact, Solomon Northup, who I mentioned earlier. If you've seen 12 Years a Slave, you know that the final title slide in that movie discusses an attempt to hold the kidnappers accountable in a criminal court in Washington, D.C., and the failure, in fact, of that case to hold anyone criminally liable for this great crime. Less known and not mentioned in that title slide is that abolitionists in New York in 1854, led by Representative Garrett Smith, soon to be one of the Secret Six who funded John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry, attempted to file petitions in the US Congress asking for the remuneration, the redress of Solomon Northup for his services as a slave. And as you can see, of course, here in the Journal of the House of Representatives, it was laid on the table and nothing came of it. But these, I think, were important contexts for thinking about Henrietta Wood's case and the ways in which it was or was not a case of reparations. But I also remember at the conference in 2015, fittingly, given Stephanie's work and the nature of the presentations, the reminder that this longer history of reparations featured Black women at every turn, dating back to 1783, when Belinda Sutton filed a petition in Massachusetts articulating the reasons for why she should receive a pension from the estate of her former enslaver for having augmented his wealth over many years. And of course, continuing after Henrietta Wood, in the efforts of Callie House, who Callie Nicole Gross reminded me of at that 2015 conference, and whose story has been told so beautifully by Mary Frances Berry in her book, My Face is Black, It's True. Callie House, a formerly enslaved woman in the late 19th century, led a national grassroots campaign to lobby the federal government to create, as she called it, ex-slave pensions for the formerly enslaved. And she wrote in that effort that my whole soul and body are for this ex-slave movement and are willing to sacrifice for it. And sacrifice indeed she did, as the movement was hounded by harassment from federal officials and spurious charges of mail fraud, and House, in addition to spending some time in prison, did not receive the bills that she and her fellow agitators had pushed for. And of course, this longer history of reparations continued into the 20th century with the efforts of women like Autumn Moore, and more recently, my representative, Sheila Jackson Lee, from the Houston area, who has taken up the cause of House Representatives Bill 40 that had been introduced for many decades by John Conyers to call for a commission to study reparations and make recommendations to Congress, that received its first ever congressional hearing on Juneteenth, not long after the conference here in Seattle. I think what I received most from that conference, though, was encouragement to keep going, because I have to say that at that moment, with this interview from the Ripley Bee, I wasn't sure, even with what I had learned about Zebulon Ward and about Gerard Brandon and about Wood's life, I wasn't sure of the scale of this story as I would be able to tell it. Was this a story like California's that could be told, as Stephanie did so evocatively in the chapter of the book, or was this a book? It wasn't clear how to proceed. And that's partly because this Ripley Bee interview, even though it stretched over 3 different issues, it was clear from the start that this was an already continued article. There had been an earlier issue of the Ripley Bee that contained part 1 of this 4-part series. And sadly enough, although this won't be surprising to historians of slavery, that issue of the Ripley Bee is the only one from the entire run that is apparently no longer extant. And so the interview began in 1853, as you can see here, with the kidnapping already underway. And Wood recalling in this first line, "That night I lay awake all night, and I prayed that the good Lord would stand by me and deliver me out of my trouble." There's very little in the interview about Wood's life prior to the kidnapping. So it really wasn't until the fall of 2015, some months after the conference here in Seattle, that several other archival discoveries convinced me it would be possible to attend to this story at a book length scale. One of those discoveries was another interview that Henrietta Wood had given in a different Ohio newspaper, the Cincinnati Commercial, in 1876, an interview that crucially began from the beginning and revealed that Henrietta Wood had been born enslaved in Kentucky, had become free in Cincinnati before being kidnapped and enslaved by Zebulon Ward. Here was a woman, this interview revealed, who had been twice enslaved and twice emancipated, and had survived not only the ordeal that I had presented about here, but a whole series of ordeals in that first history of enslavement as well.
This is Eleanor.
Audio Hearn, the interviewer,
Eleanor's not coming today. He's actually at Horse Canyon.
in the late 19th century. He went on to an internationally renowned career as a writer. He later moved to Japan and became a collector of folk tales under an assumed name there. But he started his writing career as a journalist in Cincinnati and interviewed some of the African American laborers who lived along the docks and along the water, providing historians of the urban North during Reconstruction with some of the few windows that we have onto the experiences of women like Henrietta Wood living in the post-war urban North. So that interview was critically important, despite many problems with that interview, which I'd be happy to talk about in Q&A. But really, more critically, was learning more in the fall of 2015 about Henrietta Wood's son. I mentioned that even when I came here to the conference, I had found a census record that referred to him as Arthur Simmons, but Hearns mentioned in his interview of Wood's son as a man who had gone on to do quite well for himself in Chicago, enabled me to locate information about Arthur H. Sims and his mother, Henrietta Wood, in Chicago. And it turns out that Sims went on after his mother's victory in court to a long career as a successful lawyer on the south side of Chicago, and was profiled in the Chicago Sunday Tribune in 1948, a few years before he died. Now, the article focused mostly on his longevity, that he was still active in the legal profession in 1948 at the age of 92. But it also made reference to the fact here that Sims was born a slave in January 1856 on a farm 11 miles from Natchez, Mississippi, where his mother had been sold to the plantation owner only a month before his birth. It made little other reference to Wood, his mother, other than that she was a laundress at the time. But learning Sims's name and a little bit more about his life suggested that there would be a way to reflect on that question that had been posed at the conference. Did she win? Was this a case of reparations? What difference did Wood's victory make in the lives of her son and his descendants? And third, in the fall of 2015, also in Chicago, I traveled to a branch of the National Archives hoping to find the original case file from the lawsuit that Wood had filed against Zebulon Ward in the 1870s. And when I arrived there in September of 2015, I found in the records of the U.S. Circuit Court for the Southern District of Ohio, right away in the ledgers, the number of the case, 1431, Henrietta Wood versus Zeb Ward. I found the appearance and judgment docket that listed every pleading and action that had been taken in that lawsuit. But at first, when I filled out my slip for the archivists asking for the case file itself, number 1431, the archivists returned from the stacks empty-handed multiple times throughout the day and said they couldn't find this case. And of course, given my experience with the first installment of that interview in the Ripley Bee, I was not surprised but chagrined, but I pleaded with them to keep trying to find it. Eventually, the manager of the branch, a man named Douglas McNeesey, came out and said he would try one more time to go back into the stacks, and at the very end of the day, he came back having discovered that the case was misfiled, not in the records of the circuit court, but in the records of the district court of Ohio. You can see maybe the word district here, but there it was, case 1431. And as we looked closer at the file, the names Henrietta Wood and Zeb Ward emerged. That file was bursting with additional clues, including the first paper I had seen where Wood herself would have put pen to paper and left her legal mark, insisting on the truth of her story. It included the verdict slip that the jury had written out and signed, assessing her damages of $2,500. And perhaps most crucially, it contained a document that demonstrated what I hadn't known for sure before, which was that Zebulon Ward did in fact pay the checks, the money that Wood had won, and she received satisfaction. Now, before McNeesey came back from the stacks with that discovery, I was, as I usually did, telling the story of Wood and all she had endured. And sure enough, he asked me that same question: did she win? Which, as I said before, is another version of the question of, is this case a case of reparations? And that's the question that I'd like to pose to you to reflect with me on as I tell you just a little bit more about the story and leave time for your questions about Henrietta Wood's saga. This is a map that shows really the geographies, the multiple geographies that Wood's story crossed, from being born in northern Kentucky to being taken down to New Orleans, where she was enslaved for 6 or 7 years before returning to Kentucky, then being declared free in Cincinnati in 1848, then being kidnapped and re-enslaved in Kentucky, taken back down the Mississippi River to Natchez, and then to Texas during the Civil War. And in tracing that story, I began where the story began. I went to northern Kentucky, and this is the site of Towsetown, the small farming hamlet where Wood recalled in her interview with Lafcadio Hearn being born enslaved to a man named Moses Towsey. And today, on that land, you can still find traces of the Towsey family, including the tombstone of Omer Towsey, Moses Towsey's son, who was the first Towsey to, the first man, excuse me, to sell Henrietta Wood in her life. Wood later recalled that she was born right on the edge of the Ohio River, right across from Lawrenceburg, Indiana. And indeed, this hamlet abuts the river, and you can see across the river to Lawrenceburg, which is where I took this picture, standing on the north side of the Ohio River, looking across to the side of Towsetown at the base of this power tower. And this picture, to me, really helps to visualize the thin line between freedom and slavery in this period. Indiana was a state where slavery had been outlawed from the founding of the state. And yet, because Wood was born just a quarter mile to the south across that jurisdictional line, the laws of the state of Kentucky, which held that the children of enslaved women were themselves enslaved, meant that Wood was also born into a system of bondage. Her mother, a woman named Daphne, and her father, a man named Bill, were listed here in the estate inventory of Moses Towsey when he died in 1834, as well as her brother Joshua, who I mentioned earlier as the brother who had a scar on his chin that later in the story enabled Wood to recognize him when they reunited later in life. But this estate inventory did not include Henrietta's name, because after Moses Towsey died, his children elected to divide the property, and Henrietta Wood was sold to a merchant in Louisville. That merchant later sold Wood to another merchant who took her to New Orleans for 6 or 7 years, until in 1848, she crossed the Ohio River in the other direction for the first time, and had her freedom papers recorded in the Hamilton County Courthouse, seen in the background of this daguerreotype of the riverfront as Wood might have seen it in 1848. And for the next 5 years, she lived as a free woman in Cincinnati, enjoying what she later referred to in her interviews as a sweet taste of liberty, which to me is much like closer to freedom, I have to say, is a phrase that so evocatively captures the precariousness and the tenuousness, the fragility of freedom that depended on freedom papers. And that was a life that was still just a quarter mile away from a state, Kentucky, where slavery was the law of the land. And in fact, it's that geographical proximity that enabled Zebulon Ward, as I said, a deputy sheriff in 1853, to collude with Wood's then employer in Cincinnati to lure her into a curtained carriage and confining her there to take her back into bondage in the state of Kentucky. Ward's objective was to sell Henrietta Wood for a profit, and so he headed to the jail of a Lexington, Kentucky slave trader named Louis Robards, although his intentions were thwarted, not for the last time, by Henrietta Wood's courage and determination to tell her story. She managed to divulge to a friendly innkeeper in the hours after her captivity that she was a free woman who had been kidnapped and wrongfully enslaved, and the lawsuit was filed in Kentucky, arguing that she was free. By the Fayette County Court, and then that dismissal was upheld by the State Court of Appeal. And that enabled Zebulon Ward then to sell Wood to slave traders who took her to Natchez, Mississippi, the site of the infamous Forks of the Road slave market, the second largest place where enslaved people were commercially sold in the antebellum United States, just behind New Orleans. Today, of course, if you visit the site, you will find, thanks to the work of local activists in Natchez who have attempted to raise the profile of this site in the historic landscape of Natchez. A few markers, although it's still a mostly uninterpreted space, but you will find on the placards a reference to Griffin and Pullum, which was the firm in Kentucky that handled Wood's transportation and sale to Natchez. She was sold there to a man named Gerard Brandon, the son of the first American-born governor of the state of Mississippi, also a man named Gerard Brandon, and one of the wealthiest and largest slaveholders anywhere in the antebellum South. On the eve of the Civil War, he enslaved some 800 people on 6 plantations that he owned on both sides of the Mississippi River in Mississippi and in Louisiana, which made him one of the 10 largest holders of enslaved property anywhere in the South. In 1860. Brandon took Wood to his plantation where he lived, and just outside Natchez, remember, 11 miles outside of Natchez, Mississippi, a house called Brandon Hall, which was completed in 1856, not long after Wood would have arrived there, and is still standing today, although it is being used for very different purposes as a boutique wedding venue and bed and breakfast that offers guided tours on occasion during the spring pilgrimages to Natchez, Mississippi. But I was able to stand in these rooms where Henrietta Wood would have labored and saw very little in the house to remind visitors of where the wealth that produced a structure like that had come from, except for one very nondescript placement of a cotton bowl on an entryway table. But of course, it was the Cotton Kingdom and the global capitalist markets that enriched men like Gerard Brandon at the expense of the lives of enslaved people like Wood that constructed Brandon Hall. And let me say that it was in this part of Wood's story that my research brought me to the area that Stephanie Camp did so much to interpret and analyze and help us to critically understand in Closer to Freedom. You know, if you go to Natchez today and you drive to these plantations, we can really feel the geography of containment as Stephanie described it, even in the landscaping and the architecture of these plantations. They were built to sit off the road, to be hidden by tall stands of trees that made it difficult to see in, and made it difficult to get out, and made it easier for the planter class to police the rival geographies that nonetheless did flourish in enslaved communities in the Natchez district. But I noted that in one of her interviews, Henrietta Wood recalled that Zebulon Ward had told the slave trading firm when they got her to Natchez, he had told them to, quote, get me out on a plantation and not to sell her in the city because she would likely raise another suit in the courts. There was a conscious effort to contain Wood in space where her opportunities for a resistance of that kind would be severely limited. And of course, it's there at Brandon Hall that Wood experienced for the first time the horrors of the Cotton South. In all of the previous sites of her enslavement, she had lived and worked in cities and usually in domestic spaces, doing laundry, cooking, and cleaning. But as she recalled, when she got to Brandon Hall, she was forced to sew the cotton and hoe the cotton and pick the cotton until she thought she would die. So all of Stephanie's work in her book about the three bodies, including the body on which violence was done to enslaved women, very much came to the fore in this part of the book. And in fact, Lafcadio Hearn, in his interview in 1876 with Wood, although he did detail many of the brutal tortures and whippings that Wood herself experienced and witnessed others experiencing, said that there were scenes from the plantation, as he put it, that were, quote, too horrible for publication. And yet, even in that moment, there were glimpses as well of what Stephanie had described as everyday resistance and the rival geography and the pleasures of resistance. In fact, Wood, reading Stephanie's book made me attentive to a line in the interview where Wood recalled an enslaved woman at Brandon Hall being beaten to death because, quote, she had stolen a yard of cloth to make some dress or something. Even in the lines of that interview recounting horrific violence, some indication of the body as a site of adornment, and everyday resistance and beauty comes through both in Stephanie's work and their in Wood's recollection. But Wood experienced this space, of course, primarily as a space of containment. And the logics of containment required during the Civil War that Gerard Brandon take action after the Emancipation Proclamation was issued and Union troops began to close in on the Natchez district. Brandon fled to Texas and with some 300 enslaved people, forced them on a march to Robertson County, Texas, where Wood remained for the duration of the Civil War. But as I've already told you, at the end, she returned to Cincinnati. She found a waterfront that was much changed. She had crossed on a ferry in 1853. Now there was a modern suspension bridge that still stands today near the site of that ferry ride. And she filed her suit, winning her verdict in 1878 for $2,500, and moving after that victory in court to Chicago, where she died in 1912 and was buried in Lincoln Cemetery, where her unmarked grave was located somewhere in this patch of land. And that leads me back to the question then that I began with and asked you to consider. Did she win? Was this a case of reparations? And as you ponder that question, as I pondered it in working on this book, let me just briefly tell you a little bit about what happened to some of the main figures in the story, beginning with Zebulon Ward, her kidnapper, the man who fought the suit tooth and nail for 8 years, but eventually paid. Ward, after selling Henrietta Wood to Natchez, had gone on to a lucrative career as a manager of state penitentiaries in 3 southern states, and was a pioneer of the convict leasing system that took hold in many southern states after the Civil War and have been described by some historians as slavery by another name, a new geography of containment. And based on the proceeds from that career, Ward became an extremely wealthy man. It's fitting we just had the Kentucky Derby a few weeks ago, and Ward built for himself a large horse farm just outside Versailles. In the mid-19th century, he was a thoroughbred horse racing aficionado, and in fact, he received the summons to appear in court to answer Wood's petition while he was at the racetrack in Ohio. But eventually he moved to Arkansas and ran the state penitentiary there and died there in the 1890s, leaving behind an estate worth some $600,000, making him a multi-millionaire in today's terms. And of course, the systems that he had helped to institute in the Kentucky State Penitentiary, the Tennessee State Penitentiary, and the Arkansas State Penitentiary took hold in many other southern states, including in Texas, whose state penitentiary in Huntsville is depicted here, and which has recently been grappling with the discovery of the unmarked graves of 95 African-American victims of the convict leasing regime found just outside Houston on the site of a Fort Bend Independent School District school building. So that's one side of the story, but let me not conclude without telling you a little bit about Arthur Sims, Henrietta Wood's son. As I mentioned, Sims remained with his mother all the way back to Cincinnati. He was in the courtroom on the day when the verdict was read. He moved with his mother to Chicago, and there in 1885, he managed to purchase a house in Hyde Park, not far from where the University of Chicago stands today, paying $1,150 outright in cash for this property. And based on what we know about rates of homeownership, particularly among African Americans, but for wage earners at all in this period in the 1880s in Chicago, it's highly unlikely that Sims would have been able to purchase that house without assistance from a family member or alone. And as I argue in the book, I believe it's strongly likely that that $1,150 was part of the proceeds that Wood had won in court from Zebulon Ward. Sims used that house as a fruitful asset, taking out loans that enabled him to become one of the first graduates of Northwestern University's School of Law, or what became Northwestern School of Law. You can see him here with his law class in 1889. He's pictured right back here. And he used that legal education to launch a long career in the law in Chicago, and to preside as the patriarch of a large family of children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren who went on to a variety of professional careers. The greatest privilege for me of working on this book was being able to meet one of those great-granddaughters, a great-great-granddaughter of Henrietta Wood, Winona Adkins, pictured here in her home in Oakland, California. And Winona was able to remember her great-grandfather, Arthur Sims, who died when she was about 7 years old. They lived together in this house that's still standing. And she and her cousins were able to share with me photographs of the life that Sims's legal career made possible, including this wonderful picture of Henrietta Wood's grandchildren, Arthur Sims Jr. on the right and Nita Sims on the left. This picture of Sims sitting with a great-grandchild poring over what I like to imagine may have been one of his law books. I learned, and I feel like I have to mention this in the context of Stephanie's work about the pleasures of resistance and secret parties, that Arthur Sims Jr. was given as a gift by his father a violin on which he carved his name and became one of many musicians in the family over time. So unfortunately, there's no picture that I've been able to find of Henrietta Wood herself. But to me, this picture of Arthur Sims with three of his granddaughters, Mary, Thurza, and Daisy, stands as a very vivid reminder of what she had achieved. Thank you so much. Going on a little long, but I hope we have time.
Yeah, absolutely. And we started late, so no problem. Yeah, thank you for that fantastic lecture. So if people in the audience have questions, then maybe we can take some from online as well.
So you have laid out this really compelling story, but it raises so many questions. One of which is that men like Ward were not doing this for the first and only time. They seem to have systematic knowledge about who to take into captivity, where to sell them. Could you say a little bit more about that?
Absolutely, it's a great question. It's something that historians are really beginning to understand and paint the picture of in the last few years. There's a couple of books. Richard Bell has a book called Stolen, about the similar experience of 4 African-American boys in Philadelphia in the early national period who were kidnapped. There's also a book by Jonathan Wells called The Kidnapping Club, speaking of the networks that you're referring to, that shows connections between New Yorkers on Wall Street and bets that they were making about their ability to kidnap free Black Northerners and profit off of their sales to places like New Orleans and Natchez. Professor Bell has actually estimated, although this kind of illicit trade is very difficult to find a final scale for in the record, he's estimated that perhaps as many free Black Northerners were kidnapped from the north into the south as escaped from the south to the north along the Better Underground Railroad. And so it's clear, if you look in the records of the time, that this was something that contemporaries It's a great question, and it's the chapter of the book that that really requires, much of the book follows the narrative, but that's a question that really requires stepping back and again drawing on the work of historians like Stephanie, like yourself, like Deborah, like to think about the politics of reproduction and about the ways that the archive hides this kind of information that is very important for us to know, and yet that is a question that I was not able to definitively answer. And so in that chapter about Arthur's birth, I sort of explore various possibilities, which include, which all of them, I should say, it seems to me, don't provide the possibility that Wood consented to his conception, because based on his age, she would have been confined either in the slave jail in Lexington, Kentucky, or being transported down the Mississippi River on a steamboat, where we know from other sources enslaved women were routinely subjected to sexual assault, or after her arrival at Brandon Hall in Natchez. It's a question that remains an open question, but it suggests that in addition to everything else that she endured, she was likely a survivor of sexual assault. What is clear is that Wood kept Sims with her throughout this ordeal, that he was able to, in Cincinnati, benefit directly from his mother's determination to care for him.
I was wondering, in the period after emancipation and when Wood was able to get back to Cincinnati from Texas, if you were able to find information on that, how she was able to kind of get resources to be able to make that trip?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I didn't really talk in the lecture about how I got started on this story, but I had been researching or planning to write a book about the phenomenon of Confederate planters fleeing to Texas with enslaved people, as was sometimes referred to in the sources of the time as refugee slaves. And similar to the scale of kidnapping, some historians estimate that as many as 150,000 enslaved people might have been brought into Texas during the Civil War by planters fleeing and evading, essentially, emancipation and wartime emancipation. And so this was a calculated strategy on the part of planters to break up communities and kinship networks and to remove enslaved people deep into the interior of the state that really was the last stronghold of slavery, and would remain captive there, confined or contained, if you use Stephanie's terminology, until 1866, a full year after the Civil War came to an end, after June 19th, 1865, which is typically celebrated as the arrival of freedom, because she was in Robertson County, far from urban centers. Brandon was able to continue producing crops on a rented plantation there until 1866. And then he basically, as many planters from other records we know did, sort of threatened them either to come back with him to Natchez or be left with nothing, no wages for the year of work they had done. And of course, many of the people that he had brought had family members back in Natchez as well. So there's all kinds of calculations there. But in the end, Wood returned to Natchez and worked at Brandon Hall for about 3 years before leaving to go to Cincinnati. Now, in the interview, one of the interviews, she says that Brandon never paid me a cent for those 3 years that she had worked there. And she recalled saving money by selling chickens and livestock and amassing about $25 over those 3 years that she could use to fund her trip back up to Cincinnati. But in addition to the photographs that I showed you that some of Wood's descendants were able to share with me, one really critical document that does not exist in any archive, but that had survived in the family over many generations without any context, was a contract that Brandon and Wood had entered in 1866 for her to work at Brandon Hall, laboring for the family, and it mentioned some wages or some arrangements. It mentioned Arthur by name for the first time in that contract, her son. And it had her legal mark at the bottom, but also had key stipulations in the contract crossed out. And it's not clear at what point they were crossed out, including, for example, the support of her son Arthur being included as part of the deal. And so that might have been crossed out later and could contribute to why she recalled never being paid what she had agreed to be paid or what she was owed. But she had managed through this creative way of saving some funds to, by 1869, get back to Cincinnati. And really, to make clear, thinking about the rival geography, thinking about her insistence on telling that story and not forgetting that word she was looking for him, is what I and was able to file that. So I can't remember if that was all of your questions.
We have a question that's come in through the Q&A.
Okay.
So,
We have one more too after.
okay.
However you want.
Okay, we'll go ahead with this one and then we can take another in-person one. So this says, thank you so much for this incredible story, but I'm wondering how it does relate to current arguments about reparations. So I know you posed the question to us, but this is someone posing the question back to you. So how does the US government compensate fourth, fifth, et cetera, generations of ex-enslaved peoples and their descendants? Does the government pressure current business with past history of slavery connections into pay for something or other means?
Well, those obviously are great questions, and I'm a historian of this period, but I don't know that I'm necessarily the best person to ask, or certainly the relevant party to involve in that discussion. And I also think, as I mentioned, the book Freedom is Marronage. One of the points that Roberts makes is that philosophy of freedom is marronage really needs to leave some of those questions somewhat open, right? I think Wood's story demonstrates why. It would be, I think, easy to say that she, received a check, and therefore that there was redress, there was repair, until you start to consider that it was only a fraction, right, of what she had demanded. Significant in that it was worth about $60,000 in today's funds, and it made it possible for her son to buy that house. I think it shows that even a small amount of restitution made a big difference. But on the other hand, she never received what I think most advocates of reparations would say would be a crucial part of redress, which is truth-telling and apology. Ward, for example, never admitted fault. Fought the suit to the bitter end, and even once she got that verdict in 1878, made a motion for a new trial that was eventually turned down a year later. And then proceeded, whenever he spoke about the case later in life, to tell a highly edited version of the story that reflected favorably and falsely on him. So I think in terms of the lessons the story can tell, I think it shows, and going back to the point about the number of people who have experienced something like Wood who never received a day in court, and who really would not have had the same legal standing in 1870 that she had because she had been free and then was kidnapped and re-enslaved. So it's a complicated, I wish that I could say the story has a final answer. I come back to what Professor Pryor asked at that conference here in 2015 when she asked how Wood have answered the question. And in fact, that's a question that I don't know the answer to, because the 1879 Ripley B interview was published after she had received her verdict, but as she was still waiting for Ward, as she put it, to pass over the checks. And it's the last time in the record that we really have, even indirectly, a sense of her own thoughts on the case and what she would have made of it. I think that, to refer back to the beginning of the lecture, there's a long history of reparations struggles and movements that have made this a central part of their platform. So I guess I would direct the questioner to the work that activists and community members have been doing to figure out a way, whether it's through pressure on corporations or direct payments from Congress. But I think the idea that there's not a way to do it is what I would really resist. I think the story makes clear the importance of redress and repair, that freedom would not have been freedom or would without some kind of restitution. And so the moral imperative, it seems to me, of reparations is clear from a story like this. And that many of the arguments that are made to kind of dismiss that, it's interesting to me, were made even about Wood's case in the 1870s. A lot of times, like the question pointed out, that we're now several generations removed from some of the perpetrators of these crimes, which is true if we're only talking about slavery, but of course, flowing out of slavery were many afterlives of slavery, the convict leasing system, for example, and Jim Crow segregation and housing discrimination that are much closer in time to us. But even in 1878, some of the newspapers were saying, this was so long ago, and there's no way for us to track down all the people that would need restitution. And this was in the 1870s when all of the relevant parties were still very much alive. So I think those are some of the things that, to me, the history provides that can inform the debate, but it really wouldn't be my place to propose the answer.
Great, thank you.
Thanks so much for this fascinating talk. So I'm a native Estonian, and so a lot of this just really sat with me, and thinking about sort of Juneteenth and celebrating it and it not being a national holiday or even known about nationally very recently. And so I was wondering more about sort of you being in Houston for the past, 15 years or so, and how that has influenced your research trajectory, and thinking even more largely your own positionality, how you entered this field and this work in the beginning.
Thank you. Well, that I, from being from Texas, that the stories that are told in the textbooks and in the public spaces about the history of slavery, look more like Zeb Ward's distorted versions of what happened than Henrietta Wood's truthful narratives. And so that's something that all of us who grew up in the state, as I did, and teach in the state, grapple with every day. and increasingly so these days. I was thinking some about in those 2 years when Stephanie and I were colleagues, one of the lesson plans, if you want to put it that way, that we shared in common was taking students off of campus to a statue of Dick Dowling, who was remembered as sort of Confederate hero who saved Houston from Union occupation in September of 1863, that sat in a park right off campus. You know, of course, what that meant to people like Henrietta Wood, who were enslaved in Texas, was Dowling's victory was their delayed emancipation, right? Juneteenth might have been even earlier had Dowling lost. And so we reflected some on what that statue meant. Juneteenth was celebrated in Houston from very early years after the war in Emancipation Park in the Third Ward, a 10-acre plot that was purchased by recently emancipated people who pulled together the resources to buy this park to hold Juneteenth celebrations. And in the 1890s, the city council named one of the streets bordering the park after Dowling, Dowling Street, which actually went on to become a vibrant place in the history of the Third Ward as the site of vital cultural institutions for the Black community there. But in the last few years, not only has that statue come down, but also that street has been renamed as Emancipation Avenue. I think, you know, if I could borrow Stephanie's title, maybe that's evidence of closer to freedom, but we still have a long way to go in telling a truthful story in Texas about the history of slavery there. And those are just the beginning of what needs to happen. I'm not sure if that was your question, but it's something I think about often, especially as at Rice, we're also grappling with this. I'm a co-chair of a task force there to reckon with the stories we've told or not told about our own history as an institution, including the history of our own namesakes' complicity in the enslavement of people in Houston and surrounding counties. So there's a lot of work that still needs to be done.
Any other questions?
How aware are they of just her story and their great grandfather's story? I'm just curious about that.
That's a great question, and it's really one of the mysteries to me that they were not aware of Wood's victory. And in fact, Winona Atkins, whose picture I showed you briefly, didn't know until we were talking that her great grandfather, who she knew until he died, she was 7, had been born in slavery. Now that said, it was a large family, and Mary Atkins, who was pictured on the left, Mary went on to career as a librarian. We got a master's degree at Chicago State University, and had begun before her death to do genealogical work. And she was the one who had preserved that contract between Brandon and Wood. But when I spoke with her son, David Blackman, he didn't know who was Henrietta Wood. Why was this document in his mother's possession? And so it's interesting, and of course this is not, it's not, I think different families had different ways of dealing with the traumas of histories of slavery. Some of course talk openly about the stories, and others do not. And I don't know whether Sims did and got lost along the way, or whether it was a story that he himself held close. But at least the members of the family that I spoke to were learning this history along with me in the process of the research. There is a wonderful profile that Sidney Trent of the Washington Post wrote about Mary and David and their engagement with the book and the story and their involvement in it, if you're interested in reading in the Washington Post.
All right, well, thank you so much, Caleb.
Thank you.